Picture this. It's noon in a shell hole somewhere on the Somme, September 1916, and you're eating cold makanaki stew straight from the tin with a bent spoon, because lighting a fire here would tell every German gunner exactly where you are. The stew is a gray sludge of meat and turnip that congealed hours ago into something closer to jelly than food. And you eat it anyway, because you haven't had a hot meal in 4 days. Diaries from the Ulster Division serving on the Somme that same month describe entire platoons going a week or more without a single hot meal reaching the line, living instead on whatever iron rations and biscuit each man carried personally. This is not a rare inconvenience. This happened to millions of men across every major war of the last 2 centuries, because feeding an army under fire turns out to be almost as hard as fighting one. Soldiers need somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 calories a day just to keep marching, digging, and carrying equipment. And getting that much food to a man crouched in a hole while people are actively trying to kill him is a logistics problem armies have never fully solved. Let's actually look at how they managed it, because the answers range from clever to genuinely disgusting. Start with the basic system British forces ran in the First World War. Hot food, when it existed at all, got cooked in large metal pots called dixies at a field kitchen positioned safely behind the front line, then carried forward by ration parties who walked or crawled through communication trenches, often at night to avoid observation. By the time that food reached the frontline trench, it had usually traveled a mile or more over broken ground, through mud, sometimes through active shelling, and arrived cold, watered down by rain, or simply gone, spilled by a soldier who ducked for cover mid-carry. Diaries from the period describe men eating congealed stew with their bare hands because the cold had turned it solid enough to lose all resemblance to liquid food. Rats infested trench food stores constantly, gnawing through sacks of biscuit and contaminating tins left open even briefly, and soldiers described entire ration stockpiles ruined overnight by rodents that thrived in the same mud and refuse that made trench life miserable for everyone else. British and German trenches sometimes developed an unofficial truce around mealtimes, a pattern historians studying trench warfare have called the live and let live system, where both sides quietly avoided firing during breakfast and dinner hours so each side's ration parties could move food forward without drawing fire. Officers on both sides sometimes tried to break this informal arrangement by ordering surprise attacks during meal hours specifically, and soldiers on the receiving end resented it as a violation of an understanding neither side had ever written down. Every British soldier also carried an emergency supply called the iron ration, a small tin containing bully beef, hard biscuit, tea, and sugar, sealed and meant to be opened only on a direct officer's order during genuine emergencies. The biscuit itself, made by companies like Huntley and Palmer's, was baked hard enough that soldiers joked about needing a rifle butt to break it, and more than a few genuinely cracked teeth trying to eat it dry. Soldiers softened it in tea, in water, sometimes just by carrying it in a pocket long enough for body heat and sweat to work it soft. Ship's biscuit and army hardtack across multiple centuries shared a notorious reputation for weevil infestation, and soldiers developed a habit of tapping the biscuit firmly on a table or rifle stock before eating, knocking the insects loose rather than eating them along with the bread. The tin stew itself, branded Makanachi after the company that produced it, became one of the most complained about foods in British military history. Soldiers described it as edible when hot, barely tolerable cold, and actively repulsive frozen solid in winter trenches, when the fat inside separated into a waxy layer that had to be scraped off before eating. Individual soldiers carried a small folding stove called a Tommy cooker, fueled by solid tablets, specifically so a man could heat a single tin of stew without lighting a fire large enough to draw enemy attention. Beyond raw calories, hot food carried a psychological weight commanders took seriously enough to study formally. British Army assessments during the Second World War specifically linked reliable hot meals to unit morale and cohesion, treating a functioning field kitchen as almost as important to fighting effectiveness as ammunition resupply. Mobile field kitchens, cookers mounted on wheeled carts and towed by horse teams or later by trucks, followed advancing units specifically so hot food could reach men within hours of a position becoming safe enough to cook in, rather than the days-long delay common in static trench warfare a generation earlier. Soldiers also ran an informal trading economy inside the trenches, swapping less desirable ration items for things they wanted more. A tin of unpopular stew changing hands for a few cigarettes, a share of someone else's jam ration, or simply a favor owed later. A system that let men shape their own diet slightly within the rigid boundaries of what the army actually issued. French soldiers, the poilus, received something the British did not by default, a daily wine ration called pinard, roughly half a liter per man by mid-war, distributed specifically for morale as much as nutrition. Soldiers wrote extensively about pinard in letters home, treating it as one of the only genuine comforts available in the trenches. And French military command understood its psychological value well enough to keep the ration flowing, even when food supplies elsewhere grew tight. British soldiers received their own daily ration of rum, distributed in earthenware jars marked simply SRD, issued directly by an officer using a spoon or a small tot cup, usually just before a dawn stand-to or right before an attack, specifically to steady nerves and provide a small jolt of warmth in freezing trench conditions. Soldiers debated for decades afterward what the initials SRD actually stood for. Official government supply language on one hand, and grim trench humor translating it as service rum diluted on the other. German soldiers faced a harder problem entirely, because the Allied naval blockade of Germany choked off food imports for the whole country, not just the army. The winter of 1916 into 1917 became known in Germany as the turnip winter, when potato crops failed and turnips, normally used as animal feed, became a dietary staple for soldiers and civilians alike. German rations increasingly relied on Kommissbrot, a dense, dark bread often stretched with potato flour or sawdust filler by war's end, and ersatz coffee, made from roasted chicory or acorns rather than actual coffee beans, which had become nearly impossible to import. This problem is far older than the First World War. Roman legionaries carried their own standardized field ration nearly 2,000 years earlier, a daily grain allowance of wheat, roughly a kilogram per soldier per day, ground by hand or in small milling stones carried by the unit, and mixed into a coarse porridge, or baked into a simple flatbread called bucellatum. Soldiers also drank pasca, a mixture of vinegar and water that troops found more reliable than plain water from questionable local sources. And historians studying Roman military logistics estimate that supplying grain alone to a single legion of 5,000 men required moving several tons of wheat every day, an operation coordinated through a dedicated quartermaster system centuries before European armies developed anything comparable. One of the biggest breakthroughs in feeding soldiers actually came from an earlier modern conflict. Napoleon's government, needing a way to keep armies fed on long campaigns without relying entirely on foraging, offered a cash prize in 1795 for anyone who could invent a reliable method of food preservation. A French confectioner named Nicolas Appert spent over a decade experimenting before demonstrating in 1810 that foods sealed in glass jars and heated could last for months without spoiling, a discovery that later evolved into the tin can and still underpins military rationing today. Napoleon himself is widely quoted as saying, "An army marches on its stomach," a line historians can't trace to a single, confirmed original source, though the sentiment matched exactly the problem his own quartermasters struggled with for 2 decades of continuous campaigning. Napoleon's own soldiers, ironically, still relied heavily on foraging and plunder for food throughout most of his campaigns, since large-scale canned rationing didn't reach armies at meaningful scale until decades later. During the retreat from Moscow in 1812, that reliance on foraging collapsed entirely once the countryside had already been stripped bare, and starvation killed soldiers by the thousands alongside the cold. By the Second World War, American forces carried the K ration, developed largely by physiologist Ansel Keys and named after him, designed to pack roughly 3,000 calories into a compact, waterproof box meant for combat situations where cooking wasn't possible. Soldiers complained constantly about the repetitive menu: canned meat, hard biscuits, powdered coffee, and a chocolate bar deliberately formulated to melt slowly so men wouldn't eat it too fast, a bar troops nicknamed for how little they actually enjoyed it. On D-Day itself, in June 1944, American soldiers landing at Normandy carried K rations, eaten cold in landing craft and foxholes for the first several days ashore, since establishing a functioning field kitchen under active German fire simply wasn't possible until the beachhead stabilized. German Wehrmacht soldiers carried a similar emergency reserve called the Eisern Portion, iron portion. But by the later years of the war on the Eastern Front, supply lines collapsed so badly that soldiers increasingly foraged, requisitioned, or simply stole food from occupied territory to survive. At Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 into 1943, German soldiers trapped inside the collapsing pocket ran out of regular rations entirely within weeks, and surviving accounts describe men eating horses that had frozen to death, boiling leather boots and belts for whatever nutritional value the material offered, and rationing individual soldiers down to a few dozen grams of bread a day before the remaining forces finally surrendered in February 1943. Soviet soldiers received something distinctly their own, an official vodka ration, authorized by Stalin's government order in 1941. Roughly 100 grams per man per day at the front, alongside standard rations of kasha porridge and black bread. The order treated alcohol as a legitimate part of frontline morale and endurance, distributed alongside food rather than as a separate indulgence, and Soviet veterans referred to it simply as the frontline 100 grams for the rest of their lives. Lend-Lease shipments from the United States also supplied Soviet troops with large quantities of canned meat, nicknamed tushonka, a product many Soviet veterans specifically credited decades later as one of the more reliably edible items in their entire wartime diet. In the Pacific theater, American troops fighting on islands like Guadalcanal and Peleliu faced a different problem entirely. Supply ships couldn't always reach forward positions safely, and tropical heat spoiled perishable food within hours. Marines survived stretches of the campaign on dehydrated rations and whatever captured Japanese food stores they found, and documented malnutrition alongside combat wounds as a real drain on unit strength during the longest, most isolated island campaigns. The Korean War introduced a specific new form of misery, cold rations and genuinely brutal cold. American troops in the winter of 1950 into 1951 carried sea rations that froze solid within minutes of exposure to temperatures that regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit, and soldiers described holding ration cans against truck engine blocks, resting them near vehicle exhaust pipes, or simply thawing them inside their own clothing against body heat before the food became edible at all. Frostbite and cold weather casualties climbed alongside combat losses during the Chosin Reservoir campaign in late 1950. And quartermasters afterward pushed hard for rations engineered specifically to survive extreme cold without becoming inedible ice blocks. Lessons that fed directly into ration design for decades afterward. Clean water caused its own separate crisis alongside food, since trench and field water sources were routinely contaminated by nearby latrines, decomposing bodies, and simple mud runoff. And armies increasingly relied on chlorination tablets and boiled water carried forward in the same containers as food, treating drinking water as its own logistics problem, running parallel to the fight over calories. Modern militaries eventually turned battlefield nutrition into an actual engineering discipline. The American MRE, Meal Ready to Eat, replaced older canned rations starting in the 1980s, packed with a flameless heater that uses a simple chemical reaction between magnesium and iron powder with water to warm food without any open flame at all, solving the exact problem that forced World War I soldiers to eat cold stew in the first place. A single modern MRE packs around 1,250 calories, and standard issue calls for 3 a day, adding up to roughly the same 3,000 to 4,000 calorie target soldiers have needed for centuries, just delivered through vastly different technology. British forces carry similar sealed ration packs designed for 24 hours in the field, calorie-dense and shelf-stable for years, engineered specifically around the same battlefield math that has never changed. A soldier needs enough calories to keep functioning, and getting those calories to him without exposing him to fire is still the entire problem. Every one of these systems, tinned stew, wine rations, rum tots, vodka orders, foraged horse meat, and flameless chemical heaters, solve the same two-part problem differently: how to pack enough calories into something durable enough to survive transport, and how to get it to a man who couldn't risk lighting a fire or standing up straight. Some solutions leaned on chemistry, canning technology, and heater pouches. Others leaned on morale, alcohol rations meant to make hardship bearable rather than nutritious. Almost none of them fully solved the problem of a soldier eating cold food in a hole while people tried to kill him. And the ones that came closest simply took the longest to arrive. So the picture that emerges across every one of these wars looks remarkably consistent. Feeding an army under fire keeps getting solved with whatever combination of preservation technology, morale rations, and outright foraging a given era can manage. Tinned stew, wine allowances, vodka orders, dehydrated rations, or chemical heaters that never produce an open flame. Nicholas Appert's canning breakthrough in 1810 solved the preservation half of the problem almost completely, and it still took modern militaries another century and a half to solve the second half, getting that preserved food to a man in a hole without getting him killed in the process. Somewhere between a frozen tin of Makanachi stew in 1916 and a self-heating pouch of chicken and rice in a modern ration kit, the fundamental math never changed. Soldiers still need calories. Calories still have to travel from a kitchen to a hole in the ground. And every army in history has spent enormous ingenuity solving a problem that, at its core, is exactly as old as war itself. Every improvement, canning, chemical heaters, motorized field kitchens, chased the same simple target: keep a fighting man fed without asking him to choose between eating and staying alive.